Well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to A Different Door. If this is your first time joining us, A Different Door is a different kind of worship experience where typically in this moment where you would gather together to hear a sermon, instead we gather for a conversation, like a podcast style conversation, and we'll discuss the scripture and go over some of the nuances in the midst of it, but it's a different way of connecting with the Word, and I think maybe most fitting for days and times like this where we're getting into maybe some more difficult books of the Bible.
I would say, yes.
And so today we are starting a 3-week journey through the book of Revelation. And we are beginning in the very beginning of Revelation, kind of going through and talking about chapters 1 through 3, but specifically this morning I want to read chapter 3, verse 20, just to get us into the conversation. And so here is the word. Listen, I am standing at the door, knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to you and eat with you and you with me. And so, Carol, as we jump into Revelation, tell us everything we need to know.
Well, it's funny because I feel like every single time I'm on the podcast or I'm preaching that I somehow figure out a way to work in that I grew up Southern Baptist.
Did you?
Did you now? For those of you that have been around a long time, this is not surprise news, but for those of you that are just meeting to me today, this is relevant information because this really wraps into my view of the book of Revelation. So in the little Southern Baptist church that I grew up in East Texas, a very theologically conservative church, as you might imagine, in the 5th grade.
This blew my mind when you told me this week.
5th grade, every 5th grade class did a year-long study of the book of Revelation. So we stretched those 22 chapters out, and our little 5th grade selves were taught by our children's director's wife, which was acceptable, because we were all still preteens, and she walked us through the book of Revelation in a way that was absolutely terrifying and horrifying. And what I will tell you is that in our church, we did not have confirmation. That is not something that the Southern Baptist denomination does. Whereas in the United Methodist Church, we have confirmation that happens around 6th through 8th grades. And it is an opportunity to kind of have this learning experience and accept faith for yourself. But in the Southern Baptist Church, it was more of a thing where children would make a decision that, okay, I am ready, and the language we used was to be saved, to have this salvation moment, to go before the church and say that, we recognize ourselves as Christians now and we want to be baptized. And normally what would result in these 5th grade classes is that if you had not done that yet, by the end of 5th grade, you would. And I will tell you what, I was no different, because as scary as it was to walk down the aisle in front of everyone and to be dunked in baptism in front of everyone, that was not as scary as the idea of being thrown into the lake of fire at the tribulation. And so there was some things, okay, I will tell you, between me and Revelation. And so when it was announced, like, oh, we're doing a study on Revelation, I was like, oh no.
Yeah, but I think that's important, right? Because how we view this book has been shaped a lot by the way that people have interpreted it in the last 100 years or so.
Sure, for sure.
And I think one of the things that we've learned through seminary and just our own study is words are really important.
Sure.
Right? How we say words and how we talk about things are really, really important. One of my favorite little stories that I tell a lot, right, is about a mailman who strikes up a conversation with a little boy who's out in his yard playing with his little sister. And he goes, oh, can she talk? And he says, no, she has her teeth, but her words haven't come in yet. And I think that's an important part of the growing up process, right, is getting the words in, but also getting the right words in, because the right words can bring peace, the wrong words cause war and destruction. The right words can bring harmony, the wrong words cause discord and suspicion, right? Right words can bring healing, the wrong words can cause pain and sickness. And when we're talking about the book of Revelation, so often we get the wrong words in. And part of that is because we don't fundamentally understand what Revelation is. Because we read it like we read anything else, right? And especially when we come to the Word of God, we go, okay, well, it says there's 7 seals. It says there's a giant beast that just popped up out of the sea, right? So that's just what it is. And yet, there's a lot more to Revelation than just that.
Absolutely. And so much of what we learn when we really start to dig into Revelation. So as I told Christopher, when Revelation came up in seminary, like I literally, because of this sort of, trauma ball that I have, I did the absolute bare minimum that I needed to do to pass exams. I read the book, I didn't go any deeper, I did what I needed to do to know the facts. But here recently, I've really started to dig into this book. Okay, what is here? And Christopher is so right that some of the words and the language that are used are symbolism. And so it'll say things like the place where Satan lives in the book of Revelation. And so you read the place where Satan lives, and of course as a child I was taught, and that is the place where actual Satan lives. No, they were talking about Babylon here, and they were talking about some of the things that they faced in the culture. This was not the personified devil lives here. And so there were different places where we see code language used, not meaning those actual things, like you were saying with the beast, not those actual things, Roman Empire.
Yeah, and that's because of the genre of the book, right? So I think a lot of times when we pick up a book, right, we know what the genre is, right? Well, I picked up a romance novel, I picked up a fantasy novel, right? I've picked up a book of poetry, and yet the Bible is a library of a bunch of different genres.
Sure.
It's got poetry, it's got history, it's got allegory, and the book of Revelation is actually 3 different genres.
Right, yeah, we talked about this. It's like apocalyptic literature, it's prophetic literature, and then it's also letters, which we're looking today in these 3 letters. And so I think that's where we're going to kind of focus to start. We're going to kind of get our feet wet into this, not jump in all the way. But we have these kind of 3 letters that start the book. So in chapter 1, we see John, and he is John of Patmos. So I think it's kind of interesting because sometimes we think, oh, the revelation of John. This must be the same John that wrote the Gospel of John, or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. But this is a different John. As it is today, John was a common name back then as well. And we're hearing from John of Patmos here, who was actually exiled to this little island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos because of his faith. And so he gets this vision, and he is speaking to us through the vision of words that he has heard from Jesus. And so where we sort of set up in chapters 2 and 3 of the book are that we see 7 letters that are written to 7 different churches that are in Asia Minor. It's modern day Turkey, and I think Ashley has a map that she might be able to pop up just to help you kind of get your bearings. For me, I'm a visual person. But so these 7 churches were being written to by John through the words of Jesus that he has in his vision. And in each one, we see a pattern. He writes with first starting out with an affirmation, then a correction, then a promise. There are a couple that don't have an affirmation and a couple that don't have a correction, but this pattern is prevalent enough that we see this general pattern in the way that Jesus is talking to these churches through John. Now, these churches were on a major postal route. These were churches that all had different things going on in their life of their church, that it really made sense for these words to be spoken to each of them. And so I think it's sort of interesting when we look at it. We start with Ephesus. It's theologically astute but has lost sight of its love for God. Then we go to Smyrna. It's suffering and poor, but it is rich and faithful. And then there's Pergamum. It's faithful in persecution, yet compromised. And Thyatira is loving and serving, but tolerating moral corruption. Sardis once looked alive, but is spiritually dead. Philadelphia, which is one of the churches that does not receive any sort of correction, so it makes sense why we've got a major U.S. city. Philadelphia is small but faithful. And then the last one is Laodicea, which is lukewarm, self-satisfied, and unaware of their need. Laodicea is one of the churches that doesn't receive any sort of affirmation. So we see these sort of patterns pop up in these letters that John is writing to these churches, and I think it opens the door for some interesting conversation about who Jesus is and what Jesus is trying to communicate not only to these historical churches, but to us now.
Yeah, and I think that's important, right? What is being communicated to these historical churches? Because when we look at Revelation being a mix of three genres, right? We know letters are written to a specific time in a specific
That's right.
place to address specific issues, right? And so in the modern day, the context we have is an email, right?
Right.
We write emails to specific people to address specific issues in a specific way. And if we're honest, not all of our emails are written in a real nice way. And so if somebody were to pull those and just start reading them 100 years from now, they're like, well, we've got, the Gospel of Glenn, and he writes this letter to Carol and says, hey, per my last email, right? We don't know what that means, but, and you're trying to address it. You're going through it and trying to, and so this is a letter written to specific time and specific place to specific people to address specific issues. These are 7 churches going through a challenge,
Right.
but they have a unified issue, which is the Roman Empire.
Yes.
And so when we look at that, we go, okay, this is a letter, specific time, specific place, but it can still provide truth for us today. But it's written to specific people addressing specific issues. It's then a genre of apocalyptic literature, right? Which we think end of times, right? That's a relatively new definition, right, for apocalyptic literature. When you look at the meaning in the Greek and what it would have meant for people in that time period, it's more an unveiling or a revealing. So this is an unveiling. It's a type of literature. And it would have been easily recognized by people in that time period. They know what this literature is. So as they read it and they go through, they go, oh, he's got a beast rising from the ocean. He's not talking about a beast. He's talking about the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Whereas we read it and we're like, oh, there's a beast. And okay, so which ocean do we think that's coming out of, right?
Sure.
Is it going to be the Pacific, the Atlantic? Where is it coming? And we try to read it as if it's going to actually be some beast coming out of an ocean. It is also prophecy. So he's talking about things that can happen in the future, might happen in the future. So it's an intermix of these 3 things. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're reading it. And one of the ways that I've tried to justify this in my head or make sense of it in my head this week, justify is probably not the right word, is like, what are things like that in the modern day where we were like, if we pulled it out of context, we wouldn't understand it. And the nearest thing that I have in my head, at least, is like a political cartoon.
Sure.
So you take a cartoon of a donkey talking to an elephant, and we all know what that means, right? It makes sense to us. We go, oh, that's addressing 2 different political parties and 2 different things. And you take that out of America and throw it anywhere else without context, and they go, okay, well, there's a donkey, and I guess, somebody's an ass or a jerk, and then there's an elephant. Elephants are intelligent, so maybe they think that's intelligence, or like maybe the donkey is, we need the stuff. They're trying to figure it out,
Yeah.
right? Is it the stubbornness of this, or like, well, elephants do this? Like, what are we doing here? And we go, no, let me explain it to you. It makes sense if I tell you what it means. And that's the same thing with Revelation, right? It made sense to the people who were reading it. They understood all of the allusions and the allegory because they understood the genre that they were reading, and they understood the references.
Yeah, for sure. And this is something that I found so interesting, because when we look at the book of Revelation, there are 404 verses found within it, and there are more than 500 allusions to the Old Testament in those 404 verses. So if you think about it, it's almost like it's a remix of the Old Testament. And I found this one very brilliant author that gave us an example of this and what it would mean in our times to read something like this. And I think it's worth reading. I stole this from William Pender, but he writes, suppose I wanted to make a movie about a woman named Scarlett. Scarlett, together with her dog Toto and her butler named Rhett, take in some children whose mother has died. Confronting the children's grief, she tells them that tomorrow and each day after that is another day. Scarlett builds up the children's faith so that they will be prepared to climb every mountain. Somewhere, perhaps over the rainbow, Scarlett, her dog, and the butler will find happiness, and there will be the sounds of music. And so clearly we read this, and for those of us that have watched Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz and The Sound of Music, we realize that that little movie pitch is just a mashup of those 3 things. And just like Christopher is saying, the historical readers of this book would recognize the mashup. And so it is so challenging for us. It is so fear-filled oftentimes for us, but that was never, never, never how it was intended to be.
Yeah, and so I think that's a really important place, right? The question I asked you at the beginning was like, tell us everything we need to know.
Yeah.
But that's really a great starting place to take the book of Revelation and go, okay, we're looking at 3 different genres in the book.
Yep.
And we are looking at so many just allusions to the Old Testament, right? You read this through and you see Zechariah, you see Isaiah, you see these texts that you grew up with, that you were familiar with, and you also see these allegories that John is talking about, and understanding how they are related to what you're dealing with currently. And so we read it now, I think a lot of times, through the lens of Left Behind.
Sure.
Right? And the rapture, and I don't know if you grew up reading those books or watching those movies.
Of course, it was required reading. Are you kidding?
Okay, so,
Of course I did.
I was always taken by, when you watch the movies or you read through the books, just how many like bus drivers and pilots were raptured.
Oh, yeah.
So it felt like if you're going to go into a career and you're worried about salvation, that seemed to be where you needed to go,
right.
because you didn't want to be one of the passengers on that.
Yeah.
But it's one of the interesting bits when you're looking at it of, okay, well, we read it through those eyes, and we know that a lot of that got taken from pieces of Revelation.
Sure.
And yet part of it got taken, I think, out of some misunderstandings of what the book's really about.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I found really, really interesting, and I loved this idea, is that ultimately Revelation is not the story of how the world ends, it's the story of how God makes things new. And I told Christopher that I was sort of tickled because one of the processes that we go through as pastors is that after we decide what the sermon series are going to be for the year, then we'll break them out of who is going to write the description. Sometimes we don't have the series name picked out, and mercifully it was Laura Eccles Richter, who is our executive pastor, that picked up this one, and I was so glad that I didn't have to be the one to try to write a description about what was being talked about. But when her description came out, I was really blown away by what she wrote. And what she had said was, too often we interpret the book of Revelation through a lens of fear. The truth is that Revelation offers a vision of God's healing love for the world. This worship series is designed to delve into the revelation of John, focusing on the themes of hope, divine promise, and renewal. Hope, divine promise, and renewal. And so to start to view the book of Revelation through those three things, stepping out of the things of my childhood, locusts, beasts, and dragons, all of a sudden, I was able to open this book and begin to approach it in a new way.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because, right, when we read the beginning of the introduction, right, Revelation 1, it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. And he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So it's a revelation of Jesus Christ. And what is the measuring stick of Christ? Well, it's a measuring stick of words of love, right? We go to Matthew 11:28, right? We get words of tenderness. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And he speaks words of peace, right? My peace I leave with you, and my peace I give to you. He speaks words of hope in John 14, right? In my Father's house there are many rooms. And he speaks lots of words of forgiveness, right? But Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But it all comes down to love when it comes down to Jesus, right? A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you. And by this, all people will know that you are my disciples. And so when we think about this as a revelation from Christ, right, it can't be a revelation of fear and condemnation and pain and punishment, because the measuring stick of Christ is love. And so when we pull that thread through, we see the words that Laura wrote that you read for us, and thinking about Revelation as a book of hope, that's a whole different shift, right? That is, I think, real difficult for a lot of us to hold, but especially for somebody who grew up having this book used in a way to make them almost just afraid of what could happen enough so that you make a commitment to Christ. And when it's used that way, right, then you're stuck in this dichotomy.
Yeah, and I think purposefully rereading this with new eyes and with a new backing of the theological grounding of God is love. I teach this a lot in my Coffee Talk study when we're struggling with specific scripture. And I always say now, the anchor is God is love. So if the anchor is that, and then we match it up against anything else, God is love, so God wants to make sure that you burn in a fiery pit for the rest of eternity. If that doesn't match up. And so if that doesn't match up, then we've got work to do. Yeah. And so I think that was some of the work that I did as I'm reading these letters. And I wanted to just pick one of them to kind of give some context, because we already talked about the 7 churches, where they are, and kind of the format of what we see. But I think it's helpful just to hear it. This is from chapter 2, and I'm starting in verse 2. It's the letter to the church at Ephesus. And he starts with, I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance. I know that you cannot tolerate evildoers. You have tested those who have claimed to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. I also know that you are enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name, and that you have not grown weary. So that's that affirmation point. Jesus sees all of these things that they're doing well. And then here's the correction. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember then from what you have fallen. Repent and do the works you did at first. That's that correction piece coming in. And as you read through some of these letters, some of these corrections are pretty harsh. This one is probably the lightest, kindest correction. But you hear some of these, and these can be really scary. Like, is Jesus going around yelling at us and picking apart everything that we do? And as I read this, again, with all of those things, the wind at my back and the anchor, Jesus' love, what I read this time is, oh no, that's not what Jesus is doing here. These churches are doing things that are making life harder on them, because we all know that when we are away from God and we don't have that strength that only comes from God, life is harder. And what he's telling this church here at Ephesus is, no, you've forgotten your first love. You've forgotten this wind at your back that you get when I'm right there in the middle transforming. Go back to that. And so these corrections are not out of some big, fearful, scary thing. This is grace. This is God's love for us. This is how we might think of a loving parent that would say, listen, sissy, it's okay to get mad, but we're not going to slam doors. Or it's okay to be upset with your brother, but you're not going to call him names. I'm saying those things to her because I want her to know how to function and be kind and live in the world in a way that is good and Christ honoring and leads to joy. And I feel like that is what we actually see in these letters, is this expression of love and grace from Jesus. And not only that, we see that just like Jesus was seeing and very, very much up in the life of the church and then up in the life of these people in the time of Domitian's reign, he's there with us too. Yeah. Jesus sees us.
Well, and again, we don't try to correct people that we don't care about.
Sure, that's right.
And I think that's a huge piece of it. But I think you're right. And I do think there's this piece too of all churches, right, at some point, we reach a level where we've got, some sense of order in the midst of things, and we've got committees, and things make a lot of sense when you're sitting in a room talking about it, right? Because you're trying to solve a problem, right? And if you've not had this experience in your life yet, you will at some point, where you're sitting around a room in a table and you're talking about an issue that you have, and the solution that you have in your head makes total sense to you and everybody else in the room. And then when you try to talk about it to other people, or you try to institute it, people go, what are you doing? What are you talking about? And I think back, there's this old fairy tale. Hattie's been real into, she's got this fairy tale book from when I was a kid that she pulled out of a bin that maybe we shouldn't have let her pull out, because sometimes you're like, what are we reading? Yeah. But
they don't really necessarily carry over to 2025.
You're like, I don't know that we should be reading this.
Yeah,
but it's about this little old man, and he his hands tremble when he eats, and he clatters his silverware, and he often can't get his food to his mouth, and he dribbles on the tablecloth. And as he gets older, he can't take care of himself, and so he moves in with his married son, and his wife does not like sloppy table manners. It drives her nuts. And so after a few meals at the table, she just takes her husband gently to the side and she goes, we can't keep doing this. Let's just put him in the corner and let him be, and then we can have a nice meal and he can have a nice meal and everything will be okay. And so they get him into the corner by the fireplace, and he has a little stool that he eats off of, and he dribbles, and he drops his bowl, and he struggles. And one day, after he's dropped the bowl for like the third time, she just looks at him and goes, if you are going to eat like a pig, then you're going to have to eat out of the trough like a pig. Because she just doesn't like that. It just bothers her. Thereafter, right, he ate his meals outside because he didn't want to embarrass the family. Now these two people, his son and his daughter-in-law, have this beautiful child that they love. He's 4 years old. And one day the father notices that he's playing with 2 pieces of wood on the living room floor. And he said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm making a trough so that when you and mama are older, I have something to feed you out of. And then they looked at each other, and they cried, and then they went outside, and they brought his father back, put him at the table, and got him a comfortable cushion, and sat him down, because they realized, right, that what they were living and how they were living was what they were teaching their child. And I think that's similar to what happens here. You start trying to live out your life, your faith with your church the best you can, but you don't always make the best choices, but you make choices that make sense to you in a moment, right? Okay, well, we like good table manners. We want to have a good example for our kid at the table. So we'll take this person who can't do good table manners, we'll just move them somewhere instead of trying to show love and grace and gratitude. And then a correction comes in. And I think that's the challenge, is as we are looking at Revelation especially, what are we teaching?
Yeah.
What are we teaching about who God is? What are we teaching ourselves about who God is? What are we teaching our children? What are we trying to institute in and amongst ourselves, even as a church? And how does that lead to this measuring stick that you've talked about, and that I've talked about, of Jesus' kindness and Jesus' love? How does that show up a mirror to who God is? And if the mirror doesn't show God in the midst of it, then we are probably interpreting the text incorrectly. And Revelation really is a book of hope. It's not a book where we go through and we add the numbers up and we go, okay, end of times is gonna be Y2K. It's 100%. I've looked at it. I've crunched the numbers, right? Those are not what the numbers are. The numbers in Revelation have symbolism, right? And they mean something, but they don't mean that. They're not going to get you to a date at the end of times, right? The words here have symbolism, but they're not meant to be taken literally. They're allegories. They're allusions to other things and other places and actual people and institutions and empires in the midst of a story. And we're meant to learn something from that. But most importantly, if we're using this as a weapon, especially this particular book of the Bible, we're using the text incorrectly.
Yeah, I think that is just something that we all keep in mind. So for those of us that are ready to embark on this journey or getting into Revelation, I think that we walk in with understanding this is going to take a lot of work to read. I am not going to be able to read this text as I did with my seminary eyes and just read the words and then be able to take a test on it, because there is so much more here. And this is going to take time. Words that I don't understand, things that don't feel very right, things that go, God is love, and oh, nope, that doesn't make sense. You're going to have to research and find. But I think, as we're saying, at the end of the day, when it comes to all of Revelation, when it comes to the letters that we study today, Jesus is not giving this vision to John to incite fear in us. John is trying to write a horror book or a book of terror. As we've already discussed, we know what this book is meant to be. It is meant to be a book that points us to hope, promises, and divine love. That is what we're after.
Absolutely.